mobilization against corruption. And that's something that we'll hear about more as this event proceeds today. The 9th of December is marked as International Anti-Corruption Day. And in light of that, this week was a build-up to the 9th, particularly highlighting several areas. So one is the health sector and PPE-related corruption, the issue of water and sanitation, which has been really a major issue in various parts of the country, alleged corruption linked to water deals, and at the end of the day, communities not receiving water and proper sanitation. The issue of energy, we all know the years of problems and capture, corruption at ESCOM, and the results and the impact faced by ordinary people. And then obviously that of whistleblowers, which continues to be a major issue faced by the country as well. There are other issues which I think requires ongoing focus. So if you look at the transport sector, public transport, particularly the issues faced by PRASA at the moment, the completely decimated rail systems of our country, but it's something we can take forward into the new year. And many of those issues, I think, will be framed by the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, which will begin, the report of which will be released to the President on the 1st of January, and hopefully to the public soon thereafter. This Anti-Corruption Week, there were activations across several provinces. And again, we want to thank the organizations who managed to pull off various pickets, webinars, information sharing sessions, and awareness campaigns. There were book launches. There was the launch of the international Bring Back the Gupta campaign yesterday, a report on whistleblower perceptions, and a range of community-driven initiatives as well. We think that although some of this work has gone online in light of the current issues in relation to COVID, it's not something that must continue going into the future. So we can't reduce our activism to simply being online. It must be something that we take to the streets. We must be able to develop some sort of a mass space against corruption in this country. And hopefully some of the speakers here will touch on that today as well. So while we do need to keep up the pressure in the online space, we also need to be doing a lot more grassroots work. I think this is particularly important if we look at the current context. So in relation to, for example, municipalities, we've just held a local government election, and you can see the crisis point in municipalities when we begin to see a collapse of service delivery. We've had some 20 out of some 250 municipalities that have received clean audits in the last 10. I think that's a telling indicator of the state of our municipal services. Our country is in trouble. I think if you look at the water crisis, if we look at the sewage crisis that the SAHRC and others are beginning to warn us about, the electricity crisis, the failed insurrection of July, and hopefully this event and leading into the new year, it will begin to prompt civil society organizations as well as other sectors to begin to think more collaboratively and collectively around building, I think, on a common platform towards tackling corruption and capture. I'll leave it at that. Thank you once again to the speakers and to all of the attendees for joining in. I hope this is an informative session, and I'd now like to call on Thandi Olaine, who is a business executive and lawyer, and Thandi will take over the rest of the proceedings. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, comrades, compatriots, ladies and gentlemen. I always count amongst my passion human rights, the defense of the poor and the disenfranchised. However, in this time and day, we are all enfranchised in South Africa. However, when you look at corruption, it is the antithesis of all that we stand for to support human rights. As we speak, corruption continues unabated throughout the world. When corruption threatens your existence, it is time to stand up and fight against it. In South Africa, we are engulfed by corruption. And if we do nothing about it, we are going to drown and we are going to lose our existence. So as we continue on the work that the Defend Our Democracy is doing, We are hoping that everybody is going to be part of this campaign. We know that we have got quite a number of people who are already supporting the campaign. We have a number of foundations here with us today, the Tutu Foundation, the Kathrada Foundation, and others. We also have people from civil society, business, labor, and all walks of life. We call on each one of you to ensure that we are able to deal with corruption until we root it out. As Zakira said, we have to go down to the grassroots to make sure that we deal with it. Talking on Twitter in the media space is not going to root out corruption. It may help other people to have consciences, but we need to make sure we deal with it in a way that is going to bring its extinction. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time until 4:30 with you. However, when I look at the program and look at the times that we have allocated to the speakers, we are likely to run over, most probably by 10 minutes. I therefore ask for your indulgence so that we can also take time for your questions and get the speakers to respond to you. I will introduce the speakers briefly and will allow them therefore to take their positions and ensure that they can deliver the message that they have prepared for today. I will start with Judge Johann Kriegler, who is going to address us on how corruption impacts human rights. Briefly, most people would know who Judge Kriegler is, but in the event that you may have missed his tenure, he was appointed a justice of the Constitutional Court in 1994, a position he held until 2002. He headed the Independent Electoral Commission, which ran the country's first democratic elections in 1994, and was instrumental in establishing the Permanent Electoral Commission, which he chaired until 1999. He is presently a retired judge. However, his life is very active and very full, and he is currently the chairman of the Freedom Under Law Board. I give you Judge Johann Kriegler. Thank you.
Judge, you have to unmute.
Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon, Tondi, and good afternoon, fellow Democrats. Today, of course, we commemorate the adoption of two very important documents. The one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, way back in 1948, in the aftermath of World War II and its terror and destruction. The other, our own constitution that was adopted 25 years ago today, in the aftermath of many centuries of misery, human sacrifice, injustice, and discrimination. In commemorating, one must, of course, do two things. You must think about the past and you must plan for the future. You must do a stock take of where you come from and you must do planning for the future. When we look where we stand today in South Africa, we are not anywhere near the aspirational ideal democracy that our constitution envisaged. The constitution is aspirational. It is an instruction to us to live according to the rules that it prescribes. However, if you look at the recent World Justice Program rankings, we do very, very badly in the democracy stakes. And more particularly, we do very badly in relation to our battle, our ongoing battle against corruption. And we know it does not need, you don't need me to tell you that corruption and the destruction of human rights are synonymous. In drafting our constitution, I believe we did not fully appreciate the challenge that this particular scourge would bring upon our body politic. We were wrong-footed very shortly after we adopted the constitution by the arms deal, which was the first time our doors were opened to the universal scourge. This cancer that eats at the body politic, destroys its sinews, and ultimately destroys its very existence. In our particular case, we suffered one major fallacy. It was articulated well by then President Zuma's lawyers in 2009, when they said that corruption is only a crime in a Western paradigm. And in any event, it's a crime where there is no victim. Of course, this is nonsense. This is a very, very dangerous lie. We know today that corruption strikes at the poor, at the helpless, at those to whom the state must primarily look in protection of their human rights, their right to dignity, to a decent existence. Now, there are three bulwarks against corruption. They are the investigation branch, the prosecution branch, and the adjudication branch of the criminal justice system. In our case, each one of these is under serious challenge. The SAPS command structure is a spy versus spy farce. The NPA is a public embarrassment. We have recently seen reports of conflicts about strategy, conflicts about priorities, and unfortunately, those disclosures were lacking in candor and evidenced an inwardness, a jealousy to maintain its independence and its secrecy on the part of the NPA. These are, of course, symptoms of chronic managerial morbidity. The judiciary, too, is not in a good state. It is not in a position to fight corruption, to ensure that it puts the seal on the work of the investigatory and the prosecutorial branches. The highest court in the land is barely quorate. We do not have a chief justice. We will not have one for some considerable time, and we've been without one for some considerable time. The two bodies that must see to it that the judiciary at the high court level and at the lower court level is in a healthy state, the Judicial Service Commission and the Magistrates Commission are both themselves under great stress and under a cloud at the moment. There is just too much wrong at the moment in this battle against corruption for us to be able to say on the 25th anniversary of the adoption of our Constitution that we have done our duty to the Constitution. It has served us well. We have not served it well. In the coming year, 2022, there will be much to be done. The release of the Zondo Commission will give us inordinate opportunity. It will give us exciting challenges. It will give us insurmountable obstacles. Civil society and all of us who are serious about human rights must see to it that we enter the battle, and as we were told by Zakira, not in debate, not in interaction by the internet, but by actually getting down on the ground and motivating our fellow South Africans. The Constitution is prefaced by saying this is what we, the people, say. I see our challenge in the coming year to ensure that our constitution is indeed that of the people, that they are aware of it, that in the battle for human rights, we rely on this document. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge Kriegler, for putting the platform so squarely to ensure that everybody is appreciating what we are about. I am not going to analyze what you have just said and leave it to the listeners to have some comments and questions on what we're about today. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Karin Moore, who I hope is not a stranger to all of us. She's a legal journalist who reports on high-profile and far-reaching legal matters. Passionate about the law, she breaks news on high-level profile stories and produces a number of documentaries, largely on criminal and civil court cases. With a passion for making the law accessible, Karin authored 2 books, Love is War, The Mudimule Monster, and Lolly Jackson, When Fantasy Becomes Reality. I would implore you to get them as your holiday reading. Both the product of countless hours in court and interrogating the criminal justice system. Karin is going to address us on the Zondo Commission, an overview and what to expect in its first January 2022 report. I now hand you over to Karin.
Hi, thank you so much for unmuting me. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I greatly appreciate it, and it is indeed a special honor to follow Justice Kriegler, who has been such an instrumental force through freedom under law in ensuring that Judge President John Klorpe was held accountable in terms of the gross misconduct findings made, well, the gross misconduct allegations and ultimately findings that have been made against him. I will just address you briefly on my sense of what to expect, but where the big gaps are in terms of civil society activism, which we can see through entities like Full, HSF, CASA, Corruption Watch, to name but a few, just how effectively civil society can be in pushing government, law enforcement, and other entities to do the right thing. First of all, in regards to the release of the report, it is due to be handed over on the 1st of January, but it is critical that civil society is extremely active in vocalizing the need for that report to be released as soon as possible. So we don't have a situation where the presidency sits on it for months, because it's almost guaranteed to be voluminous because of the level of evidence that's been laid, and that there may be a reaction of kind of political protectionism in terms of some of the more far-reaching findings that it's made. So we, all of us, whether it's the media, civil society activists, need to be demanding that that report is released as soon as possible. Taxpayers have spent close to R1 billion on this investigation. It is not President Ramaphosa's report, it is a report for all South Africans. And we, having sat through that evidence, having heard just how deep and profound the levels of corruption are, need to know what the report's findings and recommendations are. Just in regard to that, it's very apparent from the investigation that was done that the report is probably going to focus quite heavily on what happened at Eskom and Transnet with Brian Molefe, Machela Koko, Anash Singh, because those two entities were the key vehicles through which the Gupta family network orchestrated their alleged state capture, to the tune we now know through shadow world investigations of about 57 million rand. So we can expect that certain findings and recommendations will be made in respect to that aspect, which is one, of course, of a myriad of them. But what I think is going to prove to be very interesting is in relation to the state security agency. We obviously know that people like Arthur Fraser didn't testify, due largely to the fact that he refused to hand in a sworn statement and embarked on a kind of litigious campaign against Zondo and his evidence leaders. But so there may not necessarily be as many findings. There may be, in fact, a referral to another form of investigation in regards to SSA. That being said, it is crucial that activists push for far more transparency, particularly in the financial management of SSA. For too long, because the Auditor General is not allowed oversight of the finances of SSA, because the Parliament portfolio committees are closed to the public, state intelligence has been a vehicle for some, of the most unbelievable high levels of corruption within government. We know that corruption is endemic, but because there's secrecy and because things are concealed in SSA, it seems that has been a fertile bed for corruption. And it's crucial that activists and the public start demanding that there is financial oversight. Otherwise, that will continue to be abused. As Judge Kriegler pointed out, the NPA does not appear to be in any kind of position to take on the deluge of cases that are going to follow from the Zondo inquiry. And I think the resignation of Hermione Kaneer has definitely exposed huge levels of dysfunction within the state, particularly when it comes to the prosecution of corruption. So what are the answers? Activists and indeed the NPA, which seems to be acknowledging that it has a problem, but doesn't really seem to be pushing for appropriate resolutions or solutions to that problem. We need to be demanding that there are now strict policies that are put in place that enable resourcing of the state, particularly in terms of forensic skills, digital investigative skills, the very things that Hermione Kaneer outlined in Parliament when she appeared there in July this year. The NPA, it needs to be made possible that because we know the NPA is hollowed out, there isn't a forensic capability in the Hawks or the state, that civil society, law firms, lawyers are enabled to assist, to provide guidance on indictments, to assist with forensic investigations. That requires kind of policy, legislation, but it can, when we are dealing with the state, when we're dealing with an entity that is so hollowed out, it cannot be that becomes an excuse for why cases are not pursued. The NPA we also need to be putting pressure on the NPA to nolly prosecutize cases that they know they don't have capacity for. That is going to be a legal debate that, many colleagues will have. But if the state is in a position where it cannot pursue a case, I think there needs to be acknowledgement, and there needs to be a space for entities like, for example, ESCOM, as it is suggested in media reports, to pursue private prosecutions, to actually hold people accountable. It cannot be that the incapacity of the state becomes yet another hurdle against accountability finally being held. The NPA has also spoken about changes to POCA in terms of defining more clearly what a benefit is, looking at the inclusion in that legislation in prosecutions for unexplained income and wealth. We need to support them in that, and we certainly need to get a greater sense of what kind of changes they're going to bring. And if they are going to support and enable greater and more effective prosecution of corruption, then they need to be supported in that, and pressure needs to be put on Parliament to finalize and push that legislation through. It has been alluded to before, but the state capture inquiry has exposed just how profoundly our system is failing whistleblowers, whether it's in the corporate space or government. People came to that inquiry, I think about Themba Maseko, for example, having had their lives destroyed because they stood up to corruption. And it cannot be that our language is just solely around the protection of whistleblowers, that, you know, there's an underlying logic there that speaking the truth, that doing the right thing is inherently dangerous. We have to change that culture, or we are going to continue to see people being too afraid to speak out because of the terrible consequences they face. So it's about legal support for whistleblowers. It's about financial support for them if they lose their jobs. It's about actually going after companies or government departments that pursue what is clearly blatant persecution of whistleblowers, and actually naming and shaming them, and in some respects maybe embarking on some very clever and careful litigation to make sure that companies that do that government that do this, persecute whistleblowers, are held to account. And it cannot just simply be about protection of whistleblowers. We need to reward them. In America, when people identify or blow the whistle on corruption, there's legislation that allows them to get a certain percentage of any money that is recovered. That legislation doesn't exist in South Africa, but certainly it is something that we should consider, because it cannot be that in order to do the right thing, you put your life, you put your family, you put your job, you put everything at risk. We are telling people that it is risky to have integrity, and that is not good for any of us. Lastly, and I know I need to wrap it up, we need to, you know, it is very likely that the Zondo inquiry may face some form of review. I think that very intelligent, structured support of the litigation, support of the inquiry in terms of the litigation that they may face will be appropriate, because we can't necessarily guarantee that they will get that support from government. And then finally, I know that, you know, the challenges that we're facing at the moment are profound, and we are living a season of consequence because of what has come before and what state capture has done to this country. But I want you to consider for a moment the huge impact that activism has had, you know, whether it was through litigation, court cases, in terms of Nkolisi and Kasana, that case that got Sean Abrams out of office. You know, we have the John Hlophe litigation by Freedom Under Law that ensured that he ultimately faced a tribunal. And then, you know, the Rosatom case, where Earthlife Africa and SAFSE went to the Cape High Court and challenged the intergovernmental agreement between the South African government and Rosatom, and effectively, through very smart litigation, through a legal team that, you know, oftentimes worked on an almost pro bono basis, effectively stopped South Africa from concluding a 1 trillion rand deal with Russia. So don't ever believe that what you do is insignificant. You know, where we are today, you know, in many respects, saved from some of the worst excesses of state capture because of activism and legal work. And we cannot give up now. This country is worth saving. It can be saved, and we need to fight for it. Thank you.
Thandi, I think you need to unmute.
Using technology can be very challenging, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't have the rights to unmute, but thank you very much for those. Karin has talked about transparency, and I would just like to also say that in the audience, we have some whistleblowers. Thank you for your bravery that has caused you a lot of pain, because as we know, you come forward and you become a pariah, everybody runs away from you. We understand your pain, and hopefully we can, through Defend Our Democracy, try to give you some support. Karin also talked about transparency. And I would like to say that when there is no transparency, corruption can easily thrive. So on that note, I am going to call on our next speaker. Again, he is not he is someone who is known in this field. Lawson Naidu, the one thing I didn't know about Lawson is that he's a director of Cricket SA, and I was a director of Cricket SA before him, so we share a passion. He has 30 years experience in political, parliamentary, business, and civil society sectors. He worked at the ANC office in the UK from 1987 to 1992 as special advisor to the Speaker of Parliament, 1994 to 1999, was at Union Alliance Holdings, 99 to 2001, and now heads the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, and he has done so since 2010. He is also a founding partner at the Paternoster Group from 2015, which is a political risk consultancy. He is also a trustee of Momentum Medical Scheme. He's going to talk to us about the state's response to capture and corruption and collaboration with civil society in tackling it. Lawson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much for that, Thandi. I'm going to focus really on the national anti-corruption strategy. And I think it's an important moment to reflect on it and for people to become aware of that document and the implementation measures that are envisaged within it. But I'll come to that in a moment. But let me just perhaps start by talking about the institutional architecture to combat corruption in South Africa. So we've been adopting the multi-agency model where we have a number of bodies or agencies that have a mandate to combat corruption. This obviously includes the Hawks, the South African Police. Now we have the Investigating Directorate and the National Prosecuting Authority. We have the Special Investigating Unit, the SRU. We also have the Office of the Auditor General and the Public Protector. So there are a range of bodies, and these are replicated also at provincial and sometimes at local government level, where municipalities and provinces have instituted some anti-corruption structures. But I think what we can conclude from where we're sitting now is that corruption continues to thrive in South Africa. We've seen it in the recent exposés around the PPE corruption that has happened whilst we sitting and listening to testimony at the Zondo Commission. People are continuing to loot and steal. So this is a moment where we really need to come together to combat corruption. So this issue of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy was initiated by government back in 2015. And as is often the case with these kinds of things, especially when they're government-driven processes, take an extraordinarily long time to come to fruition. But in 2019, a National Anti-Corruption Strategy reference group was put in place with some civil society representation in order to fine-tune and finalize that document. That document was ultimately approved by Cabinet in November last year, that is 2020. So I want to talk us a little bit about what the document says, what some of its key features are, and then talk also about the implementation mechanisms related thereto. So the National Anti-Corruption Strategy is underpinned by a value system, which includes the following issues. Firstly, that all individuals, including those, especially those in leadership positions, must uphold and promote the constitutional values and the social compact that is espoused in the Constitution. Secondly, that personal behavior with integrity is critical across the board, and there must be honesty, ethical consciousness, and principled conduct in all government, business, and civil society activities. Thirdly, that in order to rebuild public trust, all individuals should be held accountable for their actions and unethical behavior, as well as the failure to act when confronted with corruption and governance breaches. Fourthly, that there must be improved transparency so that there is responsiveness, openness, and access to information issues that Karin Moore has already touched upon. And then finally, that in the spirit of partnership, there needs to be a multi-sectoral collaboration across all spheres of government, communities, civil society sector, business, and labor, so that there is a collective fight against corruption and that the objectives of this national anti-corruption strategy can actually be achieved. So how do we get there, and what are those key objectives? So the strategic objectives are as follows. Firstly, there must be citizen participation and mobilization, which is really what the issue we're engaging with today, and how to intensify that in the time to come. So, you know, it's common cause that the fight against corruption can only be won when all South Africans behave with integrity, and citizens are also empowered with the knowledge about what corruption is, what our rights are, and how we can demand accountability. And so communication and public education are vital for addressing the way in which society engages and responds both to crime and corruption. Everyone in the broad South African society should become active participants in this fight against corruption. But in order to do so, people must have confidence in those institutions, something I think we see that is sorely lacking at the moment. Across the board, the new leadership that is in place in some of these anti-corruption agencies. Secondly, there must be ethical leadership. And the success in preventing and fighting corruption is largely dependent on having ethical and accountable leadership across the sectors. Again, as I said, business, government, labor, civil society, and so on. Thirdly, that there needs to be professionalism across the board in the public and private sectors. That people must be suitably qualified and skilled for the jobs that they are appointed to do, and that they should engage in their functions and responsibilities professionally and with integrity, and to abide by the relevant professional standards. This also speaks to the issue of recruitment into the public service in particular, which should be non-partisan, and appointments should be done through open and transparent processes. Fourthly, that there should be transparent and accountable governance systems. It's important, again, to have public administration and procurement systems that are transparent and managed by highly skilled people. Accountability and what government likes to call consequence management must become the norm across all sectors, and those responsible for the abuse of the procurement system or any other assigned power must be held accountable for their actions, irrespective of their position or status. Fifthly, there needs to be a culture of reporting and whistleblowing, and the country must cultivate and foster a culture of reporting in which citizens understand the negative impact of corruption, and where individuals are also empowered to report corrupt activities. And there needs to be, as others have said, adequate protection of whistleblowers to ensure that citizens are willing to become partners in the fight against corruption. Then there's protection of sectors that are particularly vulnerable to corruption. Zakira, right at the beginning, referred to the health sector initiatives as one of those sectors that is particularly vulnerable to corruption, the extractive industries being another. So there needs to be a focused attention on those sectors that are particularly susceptible. And then the last issue in terms of the objectives is the strengthening of anti-corruption agencies. As I said, effective law enforcement must act as a deterrent to corruption, and success in fighting corruption can only be achieved by ensuring that anti-corruption agencies are truly independent of any undue political interference. They should be well-resourced with streamlined functions in order to minimize duplication and ensure the optimal utilization of resources. They must be staffed by highly skilled employees who are subjected to and the strategy document talks to the fact according of these agencies. That then brings me on to the issue of the actual National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, which is a body that is envisaged in the strategy document. Some of you may have seen a couple of weeks ago there was advertisements in the media for nominations for the National Anti-Corruption Council, and it is envisaged that a body of between 7 and 10 people will be appointed, comprising both government and non-governmental representatives, with the intention being that the non-governmental representatives will be in the majority to ensure the independence of this agency. The council will be there to coordinate and monitor the implementation of the anti-corruption strategy and report on progress to the relevant structures, both inside and outside of government. It's also anticipated that the council convene regular anti-corruption responsibility to conceptualize and put together proposals for the establishment of a permanent, independent, further consultations and see around the anti-corruption strategy, which critically must involve extensive consultations with civil society, and it must, in the interim, ensure that there is proper coordination amongst the existing anti-corruption agencies, those that I mentioned earlier, such as the NPA, the Investigating Directorate, the Hawks, the SRU, and others. So this is going to be an incredibly important body. It is intended that the President will announce the members of the Council in the State of the Nation address next year. But I think we should all try to familiarize ourselves with the content of the report of this strategy document and find ways that we can mobilize. It's certainly to be hoped that this council is going to be the mechanism that can really elevate the fight against corruption in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawson, for really bringing us to speed with what is happening between government and civil society. And hopefully, we are going to come to a point where we are going to be saying, not saying there should be, but saying there is. There is a operating law enforcement agency. There is a capable civil society. There is a system that protects whistleblowers. So let us all work towards that. And we are appreciative of the work that you and all your colleagues and other people within this strategic alliance are doing. Without any delay, I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who also should not be an unknown person to us, as she is out there doing a lot of work. Ziyanda Stuurman is an author and a policy manager at Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab at the University of Cape Town. Ziyanda works to turn academic research into the blueprint for actionable policies for the betterment of all stakeholders. Her proudest accomplishment is the completion of her book, Can We Be Safe? And again, I implore you to get a copy. This book focuses on the history, politics, and future of policing in South Africa. It's a subject that has far-reaching implications and one that has come under increased scrutiny in the past year. Ziyanda is going to talk to us about the impact of corruption on policing and in turn, the human rights of citizens relying on the state for basic safety and security, an area where we all would like to see more work being done. Ziyanda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Thandi, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's discussion. A special thank you to the Defend Our Democracy team for convening all of the discussions this week on a topic that is both vitally important to all of us and to the future of our country. So I've been asked to speak today about how corruption affects human rights, specifically focusing on the South African Police Service and unpacking some of the issues I wrote about in my book, Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa. So typically in conversations like these and with people who don't spend as much time researching, writing, and thinking about our police service in as much detail as I do, I find it quite useful to spend a few minutes outlining what our police service looks like and how it functions as an institution and structure right now. So as of November 2020, the SAPS employed 187,358 people, and roughly 160,000 of those people are police officers. According to the medium-term budget that was tabled in Parliament by Police Minister Kaneer in May 2021, the SAPS budget expenditure in 2020-2021 was 99.6 billion rand, and the institution's budget would be an estimated 97.1 billion rand in 2021-2022. It is important to note here that a decade ago, the SAPS budget expenditure stood at 55.6 billion in 2012, and therefore the current SAPS budget represents a 66% increase from a decade ago in 2012. This is one of very few state institutions that has seen such a large budget increase over the past decade. With this large and increased fiscal investment in policing over the past decade, we should see a positive relationship between increased investment and lower crime rates, right? Or in other words, because we've spent so much on policing in the police budget, the majority of which goes to police personnel salaries, we should see a similar decrease in crime. Unfortunately, that is not the case. To give you a broad overview of the state of function or dysfunction in the SAPS right now, I'll focus for a minute on murder rates and the ability of the police to solve cases related to that particular type of crime. I do this because there's broad consensus amongst policing, crime, and security experts that murder is the most reliable measure of crime levels, given that murders are often, if not always, reported to the police. So according to research and analysis by Lizette Lancaster and the Institute for Security Studies, the police's ability to solve murders has declined by 38% from a decade ago, or since 2011-2012, with the result that in 2019-2020, detectives were only able to solve 19 out of every 100 murders reported to them. Again, that's an ability to solve just 19% of all murders. In the same year, that police were only able to solve 1/5 of the murders reported to them, there were 21,325 murders recorded. South Africa consistently records about 20,000 murders a year, and it is really terrifying to think that only about 1/5 of them are solved in any given year. These abysmal performance indicators of the police's ability to not only solve murders, but to broadly investigate and solve crimes reported to them should be understood against the backdrop of police corruption that is both real and perceived. By this, I mean that several crime reporters, investigative journalists, and policing experts have written about the scourge of corruption within the police service at varying levels and what this costs us as citizens. Arguably the most knowledgeable journalist and writer on police corruption and collusion with criminals in South Africa today, Karin Moore, wrote and released a book in May this year titled To the Wolves, How Traitor Cops Crafted South Africa's Underworld. In it, she details how corruption has burrowed deep into the police service and how it disrupts the successful prosecution of criminal networks, of kingpins and known underworld characters, and importantly, how it runs good and honest men and women out of the police service. One tragic and recent example of this is the assassination of Lieutenant Colonel Shawl Kaneer outside of his home in Cape Town in September 2020. At the time, Kaneer was the provincial anti-gang unit section head, and he was investigating police corruption and the involvement of SAPS members in an illicit gun running racket. Karin Moore is one of many people who have been sounding the alarm on police corruption for a number of years now, and we should all be listening and taking action. Ironically, another voice warning of police corruption has been that of National Police Commissioner Kehla Sithole, whose future currently hangs in the balance for his own involvement or alleged involvement in corruption and the improper use of police resources for factional political aims. A year ago, in November 2020, Sithole confirmed in a presentation to Parliament that the law enforcement agencies tasked with rooting out corruption, namely the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, also known as the Hawks, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, also known as IPID, the National Anti-Corruption Unit, and the Investigative Directorate were probing 397 cases involving the police, with over 257 officers already arrested in cases related to corruption. Again, with the police service that compromises over 160,000 officers and over 30,000 support staff, that number is highly unlikely to be accurate, given that those nearly 400 cases and 250 officers are likely not a true reflection of the extent of corruption and malfeasance within the country's police service. The charges against police officers in those cases range from defeating the ends of justice and aiding a criminal suspect to fraud, theft, and extortion. In a country with both high crime levels and a police accountability agency, or in this case, IPID, that is understaffed and under-resourced, many police officers across the ranks behave with a degree of impunity and very little worry that they will be held accountable for their unlawful behavior. And that's the issue that's truly at the heart of police corruption and an inability to disrupt it. Ordinary members are thrown to the mercy of a police service that cannot rid itself of its worst members and either has no resources or political will to fulfill its mandate of accountability to the public. To illustrate what I mean, let me spend a moment describing what police corruption looks like in detail in just one example. In recent years, some high-profile cases of police involvement in gang activity in Nelson Mandela Bay have come to light in the media and in expert reports. The most prominent of those cases is that of former police detective Alicia Beaming, who in March 2019 was sentenced to 4 years in prison for defeating the ends of justice. This is because in 2017, Beaming had used her position in the Eastern Cape's specialized gang unit to withhold information regarding Hans Jordan, an alleged former member of the Upstand Dogs gang, resulting in Jordan being able to escape arrest and prosecution for an attempted murder charge. If you've been following local news in Nelson Mandela Bay over the past few years, you'll know that criminal gang activity and gang violence in the northern areas of the city of Gqeberha has increased significantly. This is also due to various gangs' ability to infiltrate not only the police, but also local government structures as well. In a report written by Kim Thomas, Mark Shaw, and Mark Ronan, they described the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality as a city under siege from both gang violence and the criminal governance of local communities. The many cases of police corruption over many years have taken their toll on the public's view of police. Survey data collected in May and June 2020 by the public opinion polling think tank Afrobarometer showed that a record low of South Africans now say that they trust the police somewhat or a lot. In other words, that means that 3/4 of South Africans, or 74% of us, now say that we trust the police just a little or not at all. Asked specifically about corruption, a majority of South Africans, or 55% to be precise, say that they believe most or all police officers are involved in corruption and corrupt activities. This very serious trust deficit and the widespread view that police officers are corrupt contributes to the deepening problem of vigilante violence in the country. If people think that the police are untrustworthy, that they're corrupt, and that they're therefore incapable of fighting crime, they turn to other extrajudicial means of solving crime. This fundamentally robs victims of crime of their access to justice, but it also robs people who are accused of crime by vigilantes of their right to a fair trial, to legal representation, and to procedural justice. Corruption takes away much from all of us, and in the case of police corruption, this is made worse by the fact that institutional and structural corruption creates an environment where the corrupt and the corruptible are emboldened, and the honest and the principled live in fear and doubt. If we cannot trust those who are meant to keep us safe, how can we trust each other? These are the very serious questions we need to ask ourselves and to ask of our leaders next time they campaign for our votes or solicit our support. We need to ask what they're actively doing to not only root out corruption in police stations, but also in the offices where police leadership sits and convenes. To overuse an old adage, the fish rots from the head, and police corruption worsens with each case of corrupt officers walking away without being held accountable, or a top police official is credibly accused or found guilty of corrupt activities. Therefore, the next time the president or the police minister or the National Police Commissioner says that they're serious about confronting corruption head on, we have to challenge them to show us what they mean by directing resources to the Hawks, the Special Investigating Unit, the National Anti-Corruption Unit, to IPID within the police. And most importantly, they must be pressed to direct resources to protecting whistleblowers and those police officers who are brave enough to do the work of investigating their brothers and sisters in blue. Thank you.
Thank you, Zianda. What a sobering presentation. You have given us a realistic overview of the challenges the country has with SAPS. It is depressing, but it's the reality. How do we address it as civil society? So with that, I'm going to move on to our last but not least speaker, Candice Chiro. Candice is an author, gender activist, and thought leader. She is better known, and some people will recognize that, as the Minister of Menstruation. Her activism is led by the belief that women and girls deserve fundamental human rights. This has informed her academic background as she educates the youth on menstruation, promotes eduliftment with the award-winning NGO Curate. She is well known for being able to influence people to speak openly about issues and empower themselves. She's on a mission to fiercely change the disempowering narrative around menstruation. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Candice Chiro.
Thank you for introducing me, Tandi, and thank you to everyone for being a part of this discussion. A little bit of my presentation really speaks to how corruption affects period poverty. And I think often a lot of people are not entirely sure what period poverty is. But in brief, period poverty is the lack of resources, being sanitary products, infrastructure, and education that menstruators, women, girls, and people who don't identify as women or who are intersex or trans or non-binary who menstruate lack during their period and are not able to therefore manage their period in dignity and care. So menstrual activism really is about providing awareness on the ground in terms of what period poverty or the reality of period poverty is within a local context, but also in a global context, but also, advising the policy to say that people who are in the spaces of sexual and reproductive health need to sort of prioritize menstrual health and not just see it as an issue where it is isolated or people need to just be silent on our periods. So as a menstrual activist, I always have to educate people on their periods, but also ensure that people understand that their periods are nothing but just a normal biological function that happens to them month to month. But besides that, I think the reality of period poverty in this country is that we can't just solve period poverty with just ensuring that young girls in particular have access to sanitary pads and the issue is resolved. We do have a sanitation crisis in this country. And unfortunately, there are young people or there are young children who go to school and are often dying due to the fact that they'll go to a toilet and it's pit latrines and they don't have the means to wash their hands or the means to throw their sanitary products away. And this is all due to the fact that, firstly, we haven't been addressing the sanitary crisis in our country, but also the fact that corruption has had a major impact on the access to clean running water and the access to sanitation. But besides that, last year it was reported that in KZN, political officials actually were not able to provide the necessary sanitary products to girls and to people in communities who needed, these sanitary pads, because it was actually used for corrupt purposes. And this made me upset, purely because it showed that there was not an understanding of the fact that a basic product such as sanitary pads can guarantee a menstruator's ability to be able to go on about social and economic activities every month to month. It also showed me that there was a lack of understanding the major impact that sanitary pads have on ensuring that not even the girl child, but also women who work, people who menstruate, who require these products. There was just a major lack of, or a major disregard for people who menstruate. And this just told me that there needs to be more work that is done on the ground with regards to educating people about the necessity of period products. If we all think about it now, if we had to go to the bathroom and we realized we didn't have toilet paper and there was no toilet paper anywhere else, what are the other alternatives that you would use? You'd probably use newspaper, you'd probably use a cloth. But the reality is that for a lot of menstruators who don't even have access to those basic things, they will therefore use unhygienic materials. And this has been researched when I did my master's at the University of Wits. This was research that I undertook to understand what is it that menstruators are doing when they don't have access to basic sanitary products. And it was reported that young girls in particular would often use unhygienic materials such as cow dung, leaves, old fabric cloths. And this had a major implication on their sexual and reproductive health in the future. So when we think of these basic sanitary products, we also just then need to realize that it's not just being able to put it in our underwear and then go about our daily activities. It also has a major implication on our health. But beyond that, like I briefly mentioned, we also need to remember that the access to clean running water is needed when we are managing our periods. Oftentimes we have been having conversations within the activist space about how we need to be using sustainable options and that sanitary pads are not good for the environment. And there have been alternatives such as the menstrual cup, period underwear, reusable pads that have been provided and donated into communities. However, there hasn't been enough research into understanding how menstruators often have to walk more than 10 kilometers just to get access to water that isn't even clean. So when we consider, menstruation, we can't just look at it as a one issue thing that only needs one solution, being sanitary pads. There's a lot of issues where we have to look at it from a holistic approach. We also have to look at period poverty in particular with regards to making sure that not only are we talking about access to sanitary products, but we're also talking about access to healthcare. There are a lot of menstruators who genuinely do not have the means, financial means, to access doctors or gynecologists when they have debilitating period cramps. And so what we are asking for the system, or rather what we're asking for the public health system, is that there needs to be access to these services that aren't often not prioritized because funds are not invested into these systems. But we also need to be asking ourselves, beyond just looking at the public health system and how it is not being prioritized due to corruption, we also need to think about the access to menstruators in the workspace and how we are not having enough conversations about how menstruators need the access to period paid leave. So menstrual health, or rather period poverty, is not just one conversation about access to sanitary products. There is a lot of information and a lot of research that needs to be done on the ground in terms of understanding how important it is that we need to intervene from a holistic perspective. And having the information, or rather seeing that government is not intervening, or rather that funds are not necessarily being prioritized to ensure that this biological function is not seen as an obstacle, is something that we, or rather as everyone here, should have a responsibility in talking openly about. And I guess it's just a matter of making sure that we do not have any form of negative misconceptions or negative taboos around our periods. And that is the first step, right? The only way we can be able to resolve period poverty is firstly acknowledging the period taboos that we carry as individuals and getting over that stigma. The reality is that often when young girls are being asked about, when they've started their periods, you'd find that they've actually started their period at a younger age, because there is the stigma that if a young girl starts at the age of 8 years old or 9 or 10, that, there's this alluding to the fact that she's being, sexually active, and that isn't the case. It just means that puberty has started earlier for her. So there's a lot of fear and stigma that has also not been properly addressed within our educational system, because when we look at puberty and we look at sexual and reproductive health and how that is being addressed in subjects like life orientation and biology, there's little to none intervention from a government perspective to make young people feel that what they go through every month, or also what they're experiencing when they start puberty, is perfectly normal. And that is why it's so fundamental that each and every one of us in this webinar, besides just talking about how corruption has a major impact on our democracy, we also need to think about how it has a major impact on the access to our human rights. And like I rightly mentioned, is that when we think of menstruation, when we think of menstrual health, when we think about period poverty, and when a menstruator doesn't have access to period products, infrastructure, education, there are human rights violations that occur. And it simply cannot be that we continue to allow misgrievances happen because of corruption, to have someone stay at home due to something that they did not choose to happen to them. Our periods are purely biological, and we have no choice as to whether we want to menstruate or not. And so it's really important that we understand that beyond just the biological, our periods are political. And as menstruators, we do have access to human rights. And this is something that I cover in my book, Flow, the book about menstruation, which is easily accessible at Exclusive Books or any of your favorite bookstores. But I'm very cognizant of time, and I don't want to take up any more time, but I do really just want everyone to just be mindful of the fact that corruption isn't just only a political thing in terms of, having an impact on our constitution and our democracy, but it has a major impact on the ground when it speaks to sexual and reproductive health rights. And as an activist who has been in spaces and educating young girls and young people in particular, and seeing the state of infrastructure at schools, I can see that corruption is still having a major and dire effect on just our education systems, and also just the ability to access healthcare systems. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak. Ms. Thandi, I will hand over the mic to you.
Thank you, Candice. Thank you so much for advocating tirelessly on the human rights associated with menstruation. When I grew up, this word was taboo. And as we have moved into our democratic dispensation, one starts to understand the challenges and limitations of people who cannot afford appropriate tools to ensure that they can deal with menstruation. So, and to raise the point of politicization of these issues, robbing people of their dignity. So we really appreciate that. And again, we have had a number of authors writing on very important issues. I'm hoping everybody will go out there. Hopefully, we will be able to put them up so that people can check them on the various platforms and get them. At this point, I'm going to give an opportunity to the audience to share questions on the chat. We will collate them and direct those questions to the relevant speakers. I would like to remind the audience that we would like you to stay with us till the end, as when we have done with the questions, we will have Professor Zeblon Vilakazi closing with some exciting information that we would like to share with you. So I'm going to open up for any questions that you may have. It is going to be a short dialogue. So we won't be able to entertain all the questions that may come up, but we are hoping that we are going to open an opportunity for people to embrace this platform, to make sure that they also go out and engage with their own communities around the issues that have been named. I know a lot of people have been asking about the books, and I think Candice has put up her book, Flow, the book about menstruation. I'm trying to see if there are any other. I like the comment by Willie van der Skeef, which says, do we not just keep on talking the talk instead of walking the talk? As a collective, we can make a difference for the good from street level up. And that is so important for us to make sure that we turn dreams into reality.
So there's a question that has come through on the legal limits or boundaries that may prevent the Human Rights Commission on pursuing cases of human rights, but I'm assuming human rights linked to corruption. And maybe Judge Kriegler or Lawson, who's also involved in the legal sphere, may be able to answer that.
Okay, I'll hand over to one of them. Justice Kriegler, are you able to take that? If not, Lawson as well.
Thandi, I do not know the answer. I'm very sorry. You better ask Lawson.
I like that honesty and candidness. I also thought, since I'm a facilitator, I won't even venture into that. Lawson, we've passed the ball to you.
Yeah, well, if the judge doesn't know the answer, then I certainly don't. But I think more broadly, the issue would be, if it's a human rights issue, there should be no limit to the ability of the Human Rights Commission to investigate a matter such as that. So unless we have more specifics, it's difficult to answer, but I can't think of an impediment to the Human Rights Commission pursuing an investigation of that nature.
Thank you, Lawson. And just for the audience to be clear about the perimeters of the jurisdiction of the Human Rights Commission, it's an investigative one, but it does not do any criminal prosecutions. It can only make recommendations. Any other questions?
Yes, so there's, I think, more comments, but perhaps some of the speakers may be able to add some insight to it, that there should be a statutory body to protect whistleblowers, lies, the weaponization of discipline processes in the public sector. So in the public sector, as well as in companies that may be involved with public sector procurement. So when people blow the whistle, there's no lengthy, I think others have talked about strategic litigation against whistleblowers and honest public servants. So perhaps one of the speakers may be able to comment on that. I think linked to this is calls for the Protected Disclosures Act to be overhauled and re-looked at. I know there are several organizations that are also looking at whistleblower policies. So again, one of the speakers, and I'm assuming Lawson, who is involved in this kind of work on a day-to-day basis, may also be able to take that up. But if there are any others that are willing to comment as well.
Yeah, Lawson may do that. And Karin may also comment, having worked so closely with whistleblowers as well.
Thanks. Look, I mean, I think it's quite clear from our recent experiences that the legal framework and institutional framework around protection of whistleblowers is woefully inadequate. The extent of protection for whistleblowers needs to be vastly expanded. The kind of protection that is afforded also needs to be enhanced to ensure physical safety, reputational safety, financial safety, and so on. And I think the idea of a dedicated agency, independent agency to coordinate the protection of whistleblowers is long overdue. And it's certainly something that I'm hoping that is built into the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and can be taken on from there. And I think the level of activism we've seen from various civil society organizations must be encouraged, so that ideas, particularly from whistleblowers themselves, of what practical measures need to be put in place that would have made their experiences much easier than it has been. So I think it's a critical issue that we need to focus on, because, as has come through from this conversation this afternoon, information is critical to combating corruption. And whistleblowers are key people who are able to bring that information to the fore, and they should be encouraged and certainly not be vilified, as many of them have been.
Thanks, Lawson. For me, it's not only the regulatory or legal framework, it's about us, society as well. You find that whistleblowers, even at work, in workplaces, are ostracized. They are not supported. They are the ones who tend to lose their jobs. Even within communities, the moment somebody is known to be a whistleblower, it's like the person has got leper. The people move away from that person. We have to change our whole attitude towards whistleblowers. Any other question or comment?
I think to Karin, there's been some questions around media protection and how members of the media themselves are under attack on social media and other platforms.
Hi. Thank you for the question. Just on the whistleblowing issue, one of the things that I find particularly problematic is that the NPA's witness protection program is fundamentally under-resourced. And if you go into that program, the kind of resources that are available to you, the kind of experience that you will have, as I've been able to interact with witnesses who've experienced that, is really, really an adverse one. And, we know with the recent murder of Babita in relation to the PPE corruption scandal, that coming forward can be a life-threatening thing. So just even from law enforcement side, there really needs to be a beefing up, and it can't be that you doing the right thing becomes a mechanism by which you are persecuted. On the social media thing, I think it's very well documented, not only with myself, but with a number of my other colleagues, Polly van Beek, Peter Louis Mayberg, Sipho Masondo, Sidi Madia, that journalists who report in the political space, in the investigative journalism space, do get targeted. And what is interesting is that there's kind of an entire universe of factual distortions that are put out to justify corruption, to justify looting, or to justify factional support of certain people. And it really is our job, as I always say, to just go and refer to the facts that we know, the judgments that were given, the evidence that we know of, and to just keep doing that. But it is part of a global project of silencing, and it is not something that is going to change. I think that, thank God in this country, we haven't had many instances of physical violence against journalists and murders. But any attack on a reporter or a journalist, in that context is completely unacceptable. But I think also one of the things that concerns me the most is that I feel that a lot of young journalists are choosing to remain silent, to not, to not express opinions on social media. A lot of other commentators, simply because they are terrified of the level of the abuse that they will get. And I think that is a very, that's a very adverse thing for our democracy. We should be able to speak about our issues. We should be able to speak about our problems and their resolutions without facing abuse. And at this point, unfortunately, a lot of our social media spaces aren't safe places for people, and they certainly don't get to vocalize, their opinions or their journalism in a way that doesn't threaten them either emotionally, physically, psychologically, or otherwise. And that's unfortunate for democracy.
So there are 3 more questions that have come through, and Thandi, if you're okay with it, I'm going to direct it to all of the speakers so that we can conclude the Q&A session. The one is to both Candice as well as Yanda. Candice, in terms of period poverty, with the money stolen and mismanaged due to corruption, do you know how much will be required to end period poverty? And I think similarly to Zianda, is there anyone doing the kind of social maths work that's required to show this money, for example, was stolen under corruption? This money could have been used to see to, for example, better establishing police station resources to deal with gender-based violence, or better resources police so that they have functional vehicles to report doing that work, and where can that be accessed? Secondly, to Judge Kriegler or Lawson, perhaps the time is right for an audit of Chapter 9 institutions, including the SAHRC and Public Protector, on what they actually do, if not protecting our human rights and democracy, and including protection of whistleblowers. So an audit on what they do. Is there a need for more Chapter 9 institutions to be established? Again, either any of the speakers can take it, or I'll comment on it at the end. Do we have mechanisms put in place to monitor and check the corruption taking place in every sector? And this person is given very detailed examples of elders that are evicted from their houses without titles, and linking that to false documents, sort of networks of alleged corruption between local councillors, banks, agents in a particular area in Gauteng, and again linking that with the issue of dignity. So I'll leave it there, and then I think once we've answered everything, we can close off the Q&A and head over to Zebra.
Who's going to start? I see Justice Kriegler. Maybe I should start with you, and then Lawson, followed by Zianda as people come through, and then Candice.
Thank you, Thandi. Very, very briefly, there has been a special review of the Chapter 9 institutions many years ago. Some criticism, some praise, some plans. None of those have actually been implemented. The flaw in the reasoning, please let me emphasize, is institutions don't make democracy work. People make democracy work. People make institutions work. The institutions in Chapter 9, some of them do their jobs well, because the people in them do their jobs well. Some of them don't function properly because the people running them don't run them properly. Your job, my job, everybody participating in this symposium's job is to see to it that those public servants who don't do their job are demonstrated to be failing in their duty to us. It's an active citizen's job to see that the country is run well. Thank you.
Thanks, Judge. I'll hand over to Lawson.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief as well. I think Justice Kriegler has referred to the Kader Asmal report, as it is known, from 2008, which conducted a review of Chapter 9 institutions. Parliament has this on its agenda and has had this issue on its agenda for many years now, but there's been no meaningful discussion of that report. And I think that given that that report is so dated now, it's 13 years old, that we need a review of that document. And as the question says, an audit of Chapter 9 institutions. Are they fit for purpose? Are they fulfilling the mandates that they have been given in terms of the Constitution? And how can we enhance their effectiveness? I think before we start a debate by adding more Chapter 9 institutions, we've got to look at the health of those that we do have. And if we need to rationalize, as the Asmal report suggested, to create a single human rights body that would encompass issues, broader human rights issues, rather than dividing them up among some of the organizations, may be a step in the right direction. But that debate is long overdue, and I think we need to have it very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawson. Zianda?
Sure. So thank you to the audience member who asked the question on sort of, police resourcing and particularly around police budgets. The answer to that is quite complicated in the sense that, not every single, and actually most police stations aren't the same as each other. So in that case, in some communities, police stations need far more resources. Some communities are best served by satellite police stations. There are varying, sort of degrees of personnel, of resources, et cetera, that should go into those decisions. So there's no one great clear answer on, exactly how much is needed to build a police station or solve crime through dedicating police resources in any given area. That said, the work of the Social Justice Coalition particularly, and around police resourcing is incredibly helpful and instructive in terms of helping to map out where some areas are over-resourced, for example, and others are deeply under-resourced because of multiple different factors. So I would definitely say to look into their work. Similarly with the Institute for Security Studies, who do incredible work also around policing and police governance in South Africa. And lastly, kind of based around gender-based violence, both Sonke Gender Justice, as well as a group called Just Detention, work a lot around capacitating the SAPS with gender-sensitive training, with particular training around collecting evidence in cases of gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, et cetera, and particularly Just Detention also does brilliant work in the work around what happens in our prisons, because that's very often a forgotten part of the entire criminal justice sector. And many people end up in prisons trapped there because of minor infractions, firstly, but not then being able to prove their identity or proof of address, et cetera, in bail hearings. So all of those organizations do incredible work.
Thank you. Thanks, Zianda. As you say, these are complex issues. And thanks for that good summary. And I hand over to Candice. I seem to leave you for last and hopefully for best.
So the question that was asked regarding whether there's any mechanisms currently at the moment, a lot of the mechanisms that are existing are purely just focusing on sexual reproductive health and menstruation, because of the implication of not speaking openly about it, leaves menstruation usually to it being addressed last. And I think what often happens is that we then see that implication being seen within the education that young people are receiving, also in terms of the distribution of sanitary products. There is a little bit of hope in that the former Minister of Finance has removed the luxury tax of sanitary products. However, there is still more work that needs to be done because people still need to buy these essential items. I also do think what is important in answering the other question in terms of how much is needed to end a period poverty. If I could have a number to it, I don't know what exactly I could quantify it but I think purely if we focus on improving our our infrastructure in terms of sanitation. And then also, I think if someone in the chat said that, there's access to condoms, and what about sanitary pads? We also need to acknowledge that we do have an HIV/AIDS epidemic in this country, but what that does show is that our country has the mechanisms and the structures in place in order to make condoms free. They can also distribute and manufacture sanitary pads and make those free as well. I think it's just a matter of adding the necessary pressure on government and on those systems to say when will be the time that sanitary pads will be free in our lifetime, but also not only that, but also putting the pressure on period product companies that also just create these things and asking them what are they doing within their companies for social, for their CSI, their corporate social investment, because they all have a responsibility in eradicating period poverty as well. They can't just be a commercialized aspect. So it's about the period product, it's about the infrastructure, not only that, but it's also about the education. And I think there's a little bit of progress with the education, because what I'm seeing with young people as well is that they know about periods, but they just are still harboring those period myths. And so there needs to be more access to multi-platform education on the ground that speaks to puberty, sexual and reproductive health from a fun, safe, and objective point of view that makes young people understand what they go through month to month. So yeah, that is my Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks, Candice. At this point, I'm going to introduce Professor Zebulon Vilakazi, who's going to give us our closing address. He is the Vice Chancellor and Principal of Wits University, and he was appointed in January 2021. He was previously the Group Executive for Research and Development at the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa, and that was from 2011. He obtained his PhD from Wits, followed by a National Research Foundation postdoctoral fellowship at the European Centre for Nuclear Research in Switzerland. He took up an academic post at UCT in 1999, and he was instrumental in establishing South Africa's first experimental high-energy physics research group. And he served as chairman of the International Atomic Energy Agency Standing Advisory Committee on Nuclear Application, and is currently a member of the Program Advisory Committee for Nuclear Physics at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Russia. I know he doesn't like to be introduced extensively, but I thought I'll take that opportunity to do that. Thank you, Prof, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I won't be long, actually. I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here because I'm an atom smasher. I come from a world of dealing with the unliving, poking deep into inner space, inner atoms and particles and quarks. So I have learned a lot over the last an hour and a half, actually, in terms of the fact that even good science itself cannot thrive in a system without democracy, because democracy allows for the thriving of the intellectual project. The intellectual project means that one must be able to free their minds and poke deep into the questions about everything from the start of the Big Bang to understanding the complexities of modern medicine. So, and I think in a society that throttles thought, then all those flickers of thought, of reason, of intellectual engagement at various levels get throttled. So I'd just like to thank the opportunity to just say a few words as we close. In particular, the role that my sector plays, the university. I'm speaking here not as a scientist, but as the head of an institution. At this period where we are observing the end of the Anti-Corruption Week and are celebrating the International Human Rights Day. As you all know, and I think it's been covered here, that the civil society has shown itself to be a fractured space. Prior to that, you remember in the 1980s, those of us that grew up in that period, there was a thriving civil society with UDF, JODEC, and many other entities at the time when the country was going through a period of turbulence. Or there was a bit of outsourcing of that towards, as naturally so, towards a democratic government, and there was nothing wrong with that. And of course, we've seen this metastasis of corruption on a grand scale, which you've all spoken about, and how it has impacted across all sectors, from even women's health and dignity to their future, because my role and many other colleagues I work with are in the role of shaping the future. So therefore, we at least as universities have I'd call it a beacon of what can be possible, what society ought to aspire for. So I think our role as institutions of higher learning is to really look into the future and say, this is the kind of citizen we want. However, at this moment, having said so, is that even our institutions broadly, I'm not mentioning any institution in particular here, is that this metastasis has hit them. You've seen so many institutions that actually have been put under a series of almost like serial administrations, right? And therefore robbing the future that you're trying to build of the next generation, because corrupt officials wants to be part, using some of the councils to tender, to be part of the tenders for all the other infrastructure built that ought to be, for the next generation of leaders that we want to build. So in actual fact, nothing is safe in this space, even the most hallowed walls of learning, our temples of knowledge. And you remember, and I'm going to be quite blunt about this now, that even during what actually was a very, I would call it a noble cause of, protesting for free education. But I don't have the number at the top of my head here. I think in excess of R1 billion was burned to the cinders, right? Laboratories were ripped apart. I mean, if a society cannot respect these temples, cathedrals of knowledge, so therefore, what you're talking about here is already almost a system that is hopeless, but yet not all hope is lost. And I do also would like to implore members of civil society and the media. Sometimes the media tends to valorize its actions, lionize its actions, when actually, they start having an impact on the future. Yes, there is a right to protest. There are rules of engagement. But when you destroy the very future we're trying to create, and we hardly hear any noise being made about it, it begs a lot of questions about us. Indeed, it will take some years to recover the ground. As a scientist, I'm a scientific positivist, that we believe that the future is better. And I think it will enjoin us all, citizens, community leaders, business leaders, the academy where I come from, civil society, to play a pivotal role in actually calling out corruption in various forms. How universities have become almost, some of the activities of some tiny fraction of students have been used as Trojans to actually weaken the institution whilst they are playing out in kind of their political spaces, and then render them weak. When they are weak, then of course, the institutions become a carcass that can be eaten away. However, as I close, we do find ourselves in a fragile space. Now, coming close to home, it would be remiss of me to say that I come from an institution which, over the last 99 years, has played a key role in calling truth to the power against the bushwhackling nationalists. They stood out. Yes, there were areas where they also collaborated as well, but this university was one of the very few that was brave and stood out there and said, we say that the university is an open space. We've lost a few academics in that regard, among others, David Webster, who was assassinated in 1988. We had the honor of nurturing leaders who have actually made a positive contribution in society, among others, of course, the father of our nation and many others. So it is now for the university, as it turns 100, to double our efforts into ensuring that we inject into our society the next generation of leaders who are ethical, brave, courageous, seek to pursue nothing else, not rhetoric, but thought, reason, because without those, society is lost. Indeed, 2022 cannot be a business as usual, like we did as a university in the 1980s, to launch projects like the CALS, Center for Applied Legal Studies, which led to the AIDS Law Project, which led to the TAC to an extent, and the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, which of course has been linked to Sonke in major ways. My university, friends, will ensure that in a small space, we'll continue playing that role, because one thing is for sure, institutions, no matter how powerful they are, political or business otherwise, cannot endure to eternity. Universities have one thing for sure, best will live for another 100 years and beyond. Universities have endured all the vicissitudes of political bullying, and they'll endure for millennia. So this university will play a role in ensuring that in our small way, in a small measure, we take society towards the society we dream of. I'd like to thank you and for the opportunity.
Thank you, Prof. If I were to try to summarize any of what has been said by the speakers, I would just spoil all the exciting information that you have received. As a facilitator, I could not have asked for a better group of speakers. Each and every one of them kept to the time allotted to and concisely dealt with their topics in an enriching way. I'm hoping that it's given you an opportunity to explore more those areas and find ways to actively participate. So in those words, I'm thanking all the participants, all the speakers, all the organizers, and in particular, Zakira and Trish, who have been a pillar of strength and support to the work of the Defend Our Democracy, as well as in terms of preparing for this webinar. So ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your Friday, and hopefully you will stay safe, make sure that you vaccinate, and keep away from unsafe public spaces. Thank you very much, and goodbye.